Before we get started with Linda's talk, I would like all of us to take a moment to reflect on the land that we get to live and grow our food on, and the indigenous peoples who have stewarded these lands for thousands of years. Many of us are joining from various locations up and down the coast and mainland British Columbia, but our transition team, along with our guest speaker, are calling in from Salt Spring Island, which is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Hulkaminam and Senchosan speaking people. Research shows that, like many indigenous communities worldwide, indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest enhance the growth and yield of desirable edible and medicinal plants near their homes through their active management of plants and forests. Something that you, as gardeners, can likely relate to is that indigenous food security and food sovereignty was and is based on their deep relationship with the natural environment that they consider themselves part of. In their worldview, we can't just have a distant relationship with our forests and food systems. So, as there is so much to learn here today from our speaker, I also encourage you to learn from the traditional ways these lands and forests were managed and tended to by the Coast Salish people. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank them for being the original farmers and gardeners of these lands.
And as Salt Spring Islanders, we are very fortunate to have Linda Gilkeson as a community resource. And luckily, you don't need to live on Salt Spring to benefit from Linda's vast knowledge, which she so generously shares. And all of her books, her courses, webinars, websites, like this one. And Linda earned a PhD in entomology from McGill, and she worked for the provincial government, promoting programs to reduce and eliminate pesticide use. She published a renowned and important gardening book, Backyard Bounty, the complete guide to year-round organic gardening in the Pacific Northwest. And I encourage all of you gardeners to pick it up. It's a brilliant resource indeed. And hot off the press, she has just published a newly revised and expanded third edition of her comprehensive pest management guide, which is incredible, West Coast Gardening, Natural Insect, Weed, and Disease Control. Linda is a regular instructor in the Master Gardening programs in BC and is busy year-round giving workshops on pest management and organic gardening. And I'm really grateful to hear that she was awarded a Queen's Jubilee Medal in 2003 and an Outstanding Achievement Award from the Professional Pest Management Association of British Columbia. So I encourage all of you, if you have yet to do so, to join Linda's monthly mailing list via her website for tips on what to tend to in the garden each month. It is indeed an incredible resource. So I'd like to welcome you back, Linda. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here again. I'll just bring up my presentation here. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I know that since you're here that you've helped in some way to donate to Transition Salt Spring, which I think is an incredibly important feature of our community on Salt Spring. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you. And I was interested to see how many Salt Spring names I saw going by as people were logging in. So I know we have people from all over the coast region and also on the island here. So welcome everyone. Well, it's no surprise the climate emergency is here. You couldn't possibly have missed it even in just the last few years. The acceleration in storms, heat waves, rainfall, climatic events everywhere on the planet. It's really been very hard to miss that. And it's clearly having very serious impacts on our ecosystems and landscapes, but human and animal health and agricultural productivity. Just think of how much damage happened last November just from that one event alone in British Columbia. And of course, that has a huge impact on the economy. And, you know, it's picking up speed. It is happening faster than climate models predicted. You know, over 20 years ago, I think I gave my first talk that was a sort of a germ of this talk. And it was once in 1 year. And it had a lot of things in it like, you know, it's coming, this is projected, this is what will happen. Well, here we are, we're in it. And now this is my single most popular talk that I give. Every time I provide a list of potential subjects to whether it's garden clubs or church groups or gardening workshops. This one is now, it's in continuous rotation, and I'm always updating it. Now I find I have to update it all the time because the climate is in fact, the wrinkles the climate is throwing us are changing a lot. And it's a challenge for gardeners. I will only be talking about gardening and growing today, but of course we can't forget the enormous social, economic challenges that is presenting as well. But from point of view of people that grow things, climate change has brought increasingly variable weather. So yes, higher average temperatures and extended periods of extreme high and extreme low. And this is in part due to the fact the jet stream is losing its energy. And there's a complicated explanation for that, but basically, since the northern part of the planet now, the polar regions is so much warmer than it was, there's less energy, there's less of a difference between that and the equatorial zone. So the jet stream that moved things along is allowing them to stall and build heat domes and, you know, high pressure, low pressure, polar vortex. These things are all sticking where they land because they're not being moved along by a more active jet stream. For us, we are even getting drier summers on average. We are getting a little more rain in the winter, but it's characterized by showing up in periods of heavy rainfall. So we're getting the total amount of rain is up a bit, but it's the more damaging heavy rainfall. It's happening in shorter bursts of heavier rainfall, and of course, increased storm intensity and higher winds. For the gardener and grower, rapidly changing unprecedented conditions require us to adapt or rethink every aspect of our growing methods. And I thought I was getting really on top of this over the last few years, and even just last year, 2022, threw me some curves that I hadn't realized. I mean, literally everything, right? You know, from the timing of what we plant, how we handle our soil, to simple things like when we're going to plant our garlic. Last fall was way too warm to be planting garlic in October. That has never happened in the 37 years I've lived on the coast, that it was too warm to plant garlic in October. So we are going to have to up our game in many different aspects. So I'll show you, while the climate projections for our region showing a warmer average temperature, here's the historical 40 years up to 1990. And this is the projected 40 years after 2040. So yes, but that's not the whole story. Our winter minimums have been decreasing. Now that's a local thing in the coastal region. It hasn't been happening everywhere. But Vancouver Island, these are two, this is Qualicum Beach and Victoria winter temperatures. These are the minimums, not the averages, graphed by Dr. Glenn Jameson. And he is showing that there's a lot of variability, we always know that, but the average lows are going down. And so that's, our winter averages are still going up. So we are seeing extremes, and it's the extremes that are going to determine what we can grow. You know, just to recap the last year or two, in 6 months from late June to late December in 2021, we set records in everything you could think of. We had the heat dome. So, and we had I think it was the third driest summer on record. Then in November, we blew every rainfall record completely out. And then we had a winter cold, unprecedented cold for the time of year in December. Then this spring, we had a record-setting cold, wet spring. And then this fall, we had an unprecedented warmth in the fall, and we had an early winter drought. And it was very odd to hear people talking about a winter drought. But, you know, lakes have only just recharged recently, and certain water districts have only just recently come off of water restrictions. So, you know, that was already there. That wasn't even a year and a half's worth of strange weather. There is a project globally by mathematicians and scientists to figure out how much of any extreme conditions, extreme weather, may be due to climate change as opposed to the normal variation that we've always had in weather. It's called the World Weather Attribution Project. And they looked at the British Columbia heat dome in 2021, and they concluded that climate change made that heat dome, which should have been a once in 1,000 year event, 150 times more likely. And so the calculation is that would bring it into being something in like every 5 to 10 year kind of event in future. But the October heat dome, which was just brought a lot of really warm, dry weather, Environment Canada meteorologist, I heard him on CBC at one point saying that had that same weather pattern happened just a couple months earlier, it would have been just as hot as the June 2021 event, but it happened a little later. So there's really no new normal. And I don't even use the phrase now that there is the extremes of the new normal, because even that we don't even know. So I'm going to stop implying that there ever will be a normal. So let's see how that's affecting our plants. Well, it clearly disrupts seasonal adaptations. If plants are used to breaking bud early in the, if they break bud as it gets warmer early in the season, then they may have flowers out present while there's still a risk of late spring frost. And that late spring frost risk hasn't gone away. So if you have your peaches and cherries blooming extremely early, they may actually have a higher likelihood of being frosted in the way the weather has been. If winter cold arrives early, or if, as the fall we just had, it's just a very long warm fall, which delays the hardening, the natural hardening off process that trees and shrubs do, then it makes plants more vulnerable to winter injury. And you see an example of leaves just being frozen on the tree. In the normal process of getting ready for winter, a tree would actually move nutrients from those leaves down into storing under the bark and into the roots. And that would be salvaged, those nutrients, and then the leaves would fall off. Well, this process obviously didn't happen in this picture. And this is a picture of my garden last fall. All of this new growth on this apple tree happened in the fall, long after the tree should have stopped growing entirely. And this is a red maple that hasn't even begun to change color on November 16th. So many plants did delay hardening off, and it was quite variable. Some plants were turning orange on schedule, and other plants were growing as if it was July. So the effects of extreme temperature on plants, well, gardeners, we know plants don't grow when it's cold. Photosynthesis actually stops below 5 degrees for most of our temperate zone plants that we grow. And we also know that frost damage occurs if temperatures drop low enough. Now, we have a lot of people grow hardy vegetables, and they're not really damaged till it's like minus 5, -9, then we can get into damage. But what, as coastal gardeners, we're all still trying to get our heads around is the fact that heat also extreme heat loses growing days as well. When it's very hot, growth also stops, it slows and stops. And when it gets above 25 degrees for, say, your cabbage family plants, or 35 degrees for the warmer season, the warmth-loving plants, photosynthesis stops, and the plants really buckle down and wait. And they have to really be in a holding pattern. They have to close up the stomata on the leaves so they don't lose water, and they're waiting until conditions get better. But that means those are lost growing days. Of course, if it gets hot enough, then the fruit and leaf cells are actually directly injured. And there are all kinds of other strange disorders and stresses, including even just poor flavors and things like tomatoes. So for some of our more cool weather crops, especially our brassicas, the more hot days there are, the longer it can take for some crops to mature. Some root crops and things might have been rather disappointing at the end of October this year. Like, why are the carrots so small? We had all this growing season. Well, we had a lot of hot weather too. So plants are quite adaptable. They will survive, especially if temperature changes are gradual. But it is very hard on them when temperature changes are out of the season that the plant is adapted for. So if it's extremely cold early in the season, early in the fall, a plant would be damaged at temperatures that wouldn't hurt it at all in January. And if a plant's had all summer to get used to heat, then a hot weather in July would not be anything like as damaging as a super warm week early in May. And we've had a few Mays where we've had 32 degrees, and that's been actually quite damaging to the spring foliage at that time. So heat waves can ruin pollen on this. These are warmth-loving crops, tomatoes and peppers. When you get above 32, the pollen is sterilized and you don't really see it. The flowers fall off. So it's not like there's a fruit that is developing and falls off. This is partial sterilization here, where it got hot enough or sometimes even cold enough that the pollen is damaged, but it's not completely sterilized and you can get distorted fruit. But when it's been completely damaged by heat, the flowers disappear. The same goes for peppers. And of course, many of us have seen all kinds of leaf injury, fruit injury. This is just simple sun scald on tomatoes. You'd think they'd enjoy the heat, but it just got too hot. And raspberries, after the heat dome, many people had raspberries that looked like this with little brown droplets in the berries. I have to apologize for this strange glitching that's going on my screen. It's something that has started recently. It doesn't seem to affect the sound and it will quit in a minute. So I don't know whether it's interference in my neighborhood or not, but don't look at my picture, just look at the screen. This is classic heat injury on leaves. You can see it's between the veins. It looks diseased, but in fact, this is just sun scald. And you can see here this rhododendron leaf. You can actually see the shadow of the leaf here, right here around this leaf. But there are growth abnormalities that happen too, and some of them be really strange. This happened because of the heat dome. This was a squash flower that had male and female parts both in the same flower. Very strange. And premature flowering, this is cauliflower, not uncommon to see. And these green shoulders on tomatoes, it's too hot, it's bright sun on the shoulders. When heat is combined with drought, then we get very rapid devastation, even at temperatures that aren't as high as the ones that would have caused some of the damage I just showed you. That's when the plants are dry, they close those leaf pores that I just mentioned to prevent moisture loss. But the leaf pores are also, moisture is evaporating from them ordinarily, and they're cooling, that's cooling the leaf. So once the plant has to do this, move to this stage, the leaf temperatures rise considerably. And you can get a lot of damage by heat because it's like turning the air conditioning off on the plant. And also those leaf pores, that's how oxygen is coming in and carbon is coming in and oxygen is leaving. No photosynthesis can happen. So the plant can't produce any food in its cells. And of course, with transpiration stopped, once those leaf pores are closed, there's no movement of water and the nutrients from the soil. There's no movement into the plant. So the plants stop, the leaves get hot, and they can't grow anymore and they can't get food. And just a tip, if you see a lot of strange, diseasey looking leaves happening to plants, but they're all unrelated plants, that's how you know there's something wrong with the growing environment and it's not disease, because pathogens are pretty host specific. So if it was a pathogen on lilies, only the lily would be damaged, but it wouldn't be everything in the same growing bed. In our crop plants, an interaction between weather, particularly heat and drought, along with the variety of the plant and some of our cultural methods and nutrients in the soil and how we're watering things, all of those interactions influence nutrient levels in the leaves and the flowers and the fruit. And we can get some very strange metabolic disorders. So the most common one is lack of calcium in the cells. And tomatoes and peppers here, this was a drought period on tomatoes in the greenhouse. And for a short period of time with the irrigation system not working, the plants ended up with a calcium deficiency because the calcium is in the soil and it couldn't get into the fruit. This is a calcium deficiency in the cells of an apple. Same thing, bitter pit. And heat and drought stress makes this far more likely to happen. Of course, this was a photo from last spring, as you can see. If we get really cold weather in the spring, it brings other challenges, of course. We saw a lot of failure of tree fruit and berry crops. They just didn't get pollinated. The insects weren't out. In some cases, the pollen may in fact have just been washed out of the trees or out of the flowers by rain. Any disease organism, any pathogen that thrives in cool, wet weather was having a dandy time, a fungus disease, bacterial disease. This is apple scab that is so bad on this tree that it's not just apples and leaves were affected. The entire fruit cluster here has died from a very early scab. So we didn't even get fruit forming. With the long, cold, wet spring, the biennial vegetables that we grow, things like cabbage and leeks and onions, celery, if they're planted fairly early in the season, this cold weather fools them into thinking they're in their second growing season. And some of them will start trying to go to seed their first summer. And that is called vernalization. And that's a problem whenever we have hardy crops out early enough in the spring that they can get a pretty good size. And then if we get cool weather, an abnormally cold spell, they change their growth pathway and they act like they're in their second year. And then, of course, anybody that was trying to grow squash and tomatoes and things last spring and put them out on your regular gardening schedule found that those plants were seriously failing because they just couldn't take up nutrients. It was too cold. So despite the fact that I've been talking about these cold and wet conditions, I still think, I think that for a lot of us, it's coping with the heat and the effects of heat and drought that are things that we're not as used to dealing with as coastal growers. There are precipitation extremes. We've already been used to having a dry Mediterranean summer. Most people that are phoning in are coming from drier areas, and a wet winter. But the drought and waterlogging cycle can injure and kill roots. And it sets up a cycle of increasing damage. If you lose some roots and root hairs in the summer due to drought, and then you lose more in the winter due to waterlogging, then the next summer the plant is even less able to get water, and it's even more easily damaged by dry conditions. So, and less able to take up nutrients, of course. So that they just become more vulnerable to drought the next season and more susceptible to root diseases. And big trees are more likely to blow down. There's a root pruning effect that happens. And especially if a tree is carrying a load of heavy fruit, or people have let ivy or other plants climb up trees and really increase the wind throw of that tree. So root damage plays a key role in nutrient deficiencies and poor growth, but also there's other damage as well. And I know you've all seen the cedars dying on the coast. It's so obvious. And tree stress, it's not just cedars. We're seeing the drier, warmer summers pretty much widespread. And this dry fall, this early winter drought would not have helped at all. I was walking in, people that on Salt Spring will know where I'm talking. I was on the middle loop in our Mowat Park last week, and there was a patch of sun and beautiful sun. And I was basking in the sun in the forest, coming through the forest and looking up and looking at the sun through all of the branches of the trees. And I suddenly realized I was standing in an entire grove of dead cedar. So that's why there was so much sun, because the trees have been dead long enough that there weren't even any needles left on the trees. But we see it everywhere. So it is the most well-known species that's rapidly disappearing, but maples are suffering. A couple years ago, there was a lot of concern about coastal salal and dieback, and it's pretty much now thought to be due to climate stress. When trees and other plants, but particularly trees, are stressed, they are open to attack. That's when the borers show up. Boring insects, boring into trees is usually because the tree is weakened. Trees have excellent defenses against boring insects. They can actually blow them right out of the holes in the tree if the tree is healthy enough. Depends on the species, but usually that is an indication the tree is failing. The borers are rarely the cause of the problem. They're an indication that there already is a problem. When you have deciduous trees that are drought stressed, like boulevard trees, you might be in Vancouver and there's a period of time when you're walking under the liriodendron, then your feet are sticking to the pavement because of honeydew that the aphids are exuding, and they're splattering out on the car windshields. Drought stressed plants, aphids thrive on those, and they just, they're a real indicator that a plant is struggling. And of course, diseases, pathogens really can overcome plant defenses, whether they're trees or smaller plants or shrubs, as soon as they're weakened. We also have more generations of some insects. Now, of course, this is dandy if aphid predators, there'll be more generations of aphid predators, which is great, except that we also have some really difficult crop pests that have several generations a season. And when we have a longer, warmer season, they squeeze in an extra generation. Codling moth, 2 generations to 2.5. Now we have 3 in a long, warm summer. It's same with carrot rust fly, cabbage root maggot, and some of these other insects. And the later generations, every generation is much bigger than the previous one. So the second generation of codling moth isn't that big, but the third generation is much bigger. So this can really lead to some pest problems that are more difficult to deal with. Okay, so that's how we're being affected. That's just a few ways of how we're being affected. So how can we address this and make both our food gardens and our landscapes more resilient? Well, the first thing I'd say is don't push the plant hardiness zones. We hear about the warmer average temperatures, but I've just shown you that in this region, with our winter lows being lower, the plant hardiness zone we're not getting warmer. And these maps are updated. If you go to Natural Resources Canada website, you'll see the maps from 40 years ago, and you'll see the maps are suggesting now, and you'll see that many of the inland communities in BC have been moved up half a zone, meaning warmer, considered warmer, but not the coastal communities. And I suspect because although they use a lot of different weather factors in calculating these zones, the winter temperature lows make a lot of difference to these calculations. It's also, anybody that lives in this region knows perfectly well that our geography is so complicated that it's very difficult to apply these zones anyway. I live a mile as the crow flies from a kilometer as the crow flies from Ganges, but I'm up a mountain and they're in a valley, and it changes everything. So very fine microclimate differences make a difference to us, but basically it ain't getting warmer here in wintertime for our lows, and that is going to matter to our plant material. It's probably going to be an important limit, at least for now. That's what's happening. An important limit for Vancouver Island as well. So choosing resilient landscape plants means looking at plants that are likely to survive a colder zone than we have been thinking about, but also summer heat. And looking at plants that are not on the edge of their range if they're native plants, or on the edge of a climate zone, like pushing the climate hardiness zone. Of course, planting perennials is always a good idea because once they're established, they're usually less vulnerable to variable weather. And sometimes if they're damaged by weather, with the more established root systems that they have, they come back or they can survive it. And they will need less water generally than annuals or first year new plants. Now, generally, planting any species with low water requirements in our landscapes is going to be increasingly important as population increase and climate change both put immense pressure on the water that is available in the summer. And plant resilient native plants, many species are doing well, and they're trouble-free and they're easy to grow. And they don't need irrigation in the summer, which is always a plus, but they're ecologically very valuable as well. I have another talk that's become very popular, and it's talking about where have all the insects gone? And wherever the insects go, the birds have gone, and they're all, it's based in availability of food plants. And anytime that we can restore native vegetation, please, please consider doing it. Here's just a few suggestions here of pretty tough, pretty important plants. In this case, they feed beneficial insects that are native. The problem with a lot of insects is they're very specific about what they'll eat. So if they're an insect that really likes sedum spathulifolium, it's a beautiful little butterfly that eats this. If that's not there, they're not going to survive. That's it. That's their food. So some of this is extremely important ecologically. We're looking at landscape trees of the future, species that are well adapted to the soil and site that you have And you may need to improve the drainage. Drainage may be beginning to fail, or there may be longer periods of waterlogging in soils, and you may have to address that. Even though trees may have been there for some years, things can change. The climate has changed. And then of course there's activity in the neighborhood that can change water patterns. But with these longer periods of heavy rain, a site that might have been just okay, barely for trees, may now be poorer and they won't thrive. The trees that are being affected most, of course, are the cedar, the western red cedar, maple, birch, and hemlock. Some of these others don't seem to be as affected so far. And if you're planting native trees, there's still a good possibility of planting spruce, pine, oak, arbutus. So far, so good. Any of the species that are prone to breakage or make no sense at all anymore in a landscape. And, you know, again, I put a plug in here for especially valuable native species. For fruit trees, looking at our gardens, because the risk of the late spring frost isn't going away, if you haven't chosen your trees yet, the ones that bloom later, if you look at apple trees, for example, there's actually quite a spread between when early flowering apples bloom and later varieties bloom. And it isn't always got to do with how late the crop comes on the tree or when it's harvested. It's just a characteristic of those varieties. So anytime you can plant later flowering varieties, you will reduce the risk of a late frost, damaging those flowers. Self-fertile fruit, you know, a lot of fruit, like think about apples and a lot of pears, need to have a cross-pollinator. But if you're looking at plums and cherries, many varieties are self-fertile, and they would make more sense to plant than the ones that require a cross-pollinator, just because they have a better chance of being pollinated. And of course, there's things like grapes and fruit that actually don't require insect pollination at all. And they seem to be doing quite fine in our gardens. There are a few apple varieties that really are prone to these stress disorders. I showed you a picture of bitter pit earlier, and this is a picture of water core, both of which are calcium deficiencies in the cells of the apple, but it's more related to the heat and drought stress. You may have plenty of calcium in the soil, and these varieties may still show this kind of strange disorder. So looking at disease-resistant plants, you know, there are the diseases of wet weather. When you can get crop plants, especially things like apples and pears and vegetables that are resistant to common diseases, then that lowers the risk when we get really bad weather. Scab resistance in apples and pears, downy mildew resistance, botrytis resistant tulips. I'm pointing an arrow here. You can see a lot of damage here this spring to tulips that are not resistant, but here are some that are just doing well. Early blight it's not the same as late blight. It's a different tomato disease, but these are all available, readily available. And there are diseases of dry weather, powdery mildews, primarily. This is the white powder that we see. Well, that's many different kinds of fungi that go on many different kinds of plants, whether they're flowers or food plants. But there's a lot of breeding for resistance or testing for resistance. I'll just show you last year with scab, apple scab it was just the most perfect year there ever was for apple scab to reproduce consistently and put many generations of spores out onto apple leaves, flowers, and fruit. And this is a scab-resistant tree, which is about 4-5 meters away from a scab-susceptible tree. And this is what happened. This is the scab-susceptible gala tree with some injury here, but it got worse and worse. This is one of my trees. I had to pull a lot of fruit off that tree because it was impossible. So in October, this is what I was harvesting. Every apple from the Honeycrisp looked fine. And gala, there really was basically nothing salvageable. And that's simply a choice of varieties. There was no treatment for scab on any of these trees. When it comes to our crop plants, there's such a big difference between cultivars in how they might tolerate the weather extremes. or conditions in your garden or in conditions from year to year, that it's always wise to grow several varieties. Try and grow 2 or 3 varieties of carrots and cabbage. And many people grow lots of different varieties of tomatoes anyway, and peppers. And that's always really wise as well, because, you know, brandywines are dandy in a long, hot summer. But last summer, people with brandywines luckily got a warm October, or they wouldn't have really had any fruit. So a lot of the small fruited tomatoes are not only earlier, but there are actually some varieties that are very cold hardy. So grow a bit of everything and keep records and tell other gardeners what's worked. So things like cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, cabbage, sweet corn, and the big tomatoes are particularly sensitive to adverse weather. Oh, cauliflower is one of my favorite vegetables, but boy, is it a pain at times because it doesn't like anything wrong with its environment. But there's some big differences between different varieties that you will see when you've got several varieties growing at once. And I'm putting a real plug in here. Most of you know that I really, really promote having food in the garden all year round, having hardy plants out there. Those hardy plants, even if it's too cold for you to be harvesting anything, they have very deep roots. And as soon as the weather warms up in the spring, this is April, this is May, this is the same bed. This is chard that really I wasn't harvesting anything then, but look at, it just leaps out of the ground. And nothing can grow as fast as an overwintered deep, big root. It's full of food. It's a big plant, and, pests and poor weather, it can handle that. And think of trying to put a little tiny chard seedling out in the garden. It would be nothing like trying to grow this. So moving to as much overwintered hardy material as possible, even if the winter is bad, most of the time those crops come back from their roots very quickly in the spring. And I do want to put in here, this is what I mean about reconsidering everything we know about gardening here. So many people put raised beds down or consider raised beds automatically. And I think there's been a lot of gardening literature and a lot of information about that. Permanent beds, we should consider, absolutely. Permanent beds are excellent because you always have a place to walk that isn't in your garden bed. And you expend just the nutrients and the amendments, the irrigation goes on where the plants are growing, but you walk somewhere else where you're compacting the soil. That is very solid approach to a garden. But whether those beds need to be raised or not, we have to think about that. Because if it's a wet spot, yes, that provides better drainage and the soil will warm up early in the spring. But they need more irrigation in the summer. And the soil is warmer in heat waves. And it can be too hot to grow some of our common vegetables that people really like to grow. So there's a lot of, there are reasons to have raised beds, but there's plenty of reasons not to have them as well. And so it's not a given. I think permanent beds is pretty much a given in most situations. But think about whether you need raised beds or not. And whatever's going on with the weather, we have to adapt to it. Cold year, cold spring, warm year, hot spring, cold, cool summer. We can get the way the weather patterns are going, we could easily get a very cool summer, as well as the extreme heat. So anytime plants are beginning to fail because of adverse weather, if it's too hot for peas or cauliflower, take them out. Too cold for melons or eggplants, take them out and replace them. There are a lot of vegetable varieties that are pretty early or short season that could be planted whatever's going on in the current weather. If it was too hot for peas, then we could plant more zucchini or more beans or a lot of little root crops, turnips, beets. They are lovely baby vegetables. Kale is very tolerant of heat. It does, of course, kale's tolerant of everything. There are a number of things that you could quite quickly fill the garden with from this list. And the same goes for a cool summer. There are a number of things that do very, very well in cool weather. And if it's just been a prolonged cool weather, then replace them. And sorry, just to go back to this, I know I talk to gardeners sometime who say, well, I planted something like carrots and it didn't work out this year. And I'm like, well, do it again, because we've got months we can plant carrots. So if it didn't work out, try it again and try it again if you want a crop, because it's really not over till about the first week of July. It's still not too late to plant carrots or many of these things. And adapt the seeding methods to the current weather. Again, coastal gardeners know about cool weather in the spring. We know the soil has to warm up. You know, it's really got to be 15 degrees before you sow vegetable seeds, almost, you know, even warmer for things like beans and corn. And we wait till the soil is warmer, or you might lay a cold frame over it or put some plastic over it to warm the soil up. But it can also be too hot for vegetables to germinate. And that can happen, well, often in the summer, yes, but I've seen it in the first week or two of May, that it's too warm to germinate lettuce and carrots. So in that case, we will sow seeds a little deeper and then water the bed really well and then shade it. Put something on top. This happens to be burlap. If you bought compost in bags, cut those bags open and put the white side up on the plastic bags. Any kind of shading, but it's the soil has to be shaded, or some of these seeds will not do very well. And that can happen anytime. And be ready for heat waves anytime. The minute those little seedlings come up under that burlap, you need to take it off, and it may still be too hot. In which case, you know, whatever you've got, these little seed trays upside down works great. You can put shade cloth on them. Whatever's going on, shade them. And the priorities are seedlings, and of course, any cabbage family cool weather crops, lettuce, peas, greens, things like that. And try and get some fine mulch in and around that soil as soon as possible. This is where last year's leaves that you might have used, they're saved for mulch this summer. They're so brittle that they can be broken up in your hands very quickly and almost into a powder, and get a very light mulch onto the soil surface. Increase watering if you can. Shading will slow down the growth, but heat will kill those plants. And invest in shade materials generally for vegetable gardens. Now this, I'm talking about vegetables mainly, but if you're a rhododendron grower, you might get some of this on site as well. You can buy shade cloth. I hate to be buying more plastic items. If you've got shade cloth, use it. What you're looking for is 50% shade. When you have a material that cuts out some light, but not all, you can leave it covering the beds. And this material is so lightweight that you can just lie it on top of the broccoli and the cauliflower and things, and just leave it shaded for the week that it's very hot. But you know, a lace tablecloth or window curtains that you get at the thrift shop, I have a lot of $2 thrift shop yardage, works great. If it's cutting out too much light, you can deploy it in the hottest part of the day, sort of from 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. As long as the plants can get some light, especially morning light, it works fine. Or you could go to proper lath work. Wooden lath work, you can tent it up like this, or you can make like flat surfaces, flat lath panels with little legs on the corners, and just make it the size of your garden beds. These prefab panels have turned out to be quite expensive now. They used to not be very expensive, but they're getting very expensive. I'm hoping that somebody that does basketry will start making simple panels, because I can't think of anything more lightweight and easy to use than panels of basketry, lightweight material that could just be stood together like this in a form, tripod form over vegetables. People with greenhouses and tunnels as well, plastic tunnels, are finding that they're not getting the results that they hoped. And it's almost always because they can't dump heat well enough. A regular glass greenhouse, no matter how much you spend for that greenhouse, those very nice greenhouses, hall greenhouses and things, they are not designed well enough to dump heat passively. You may need to add vents, you need to have all the doors and vents open, but you may need fans. And if it's a plastic greenhouse, it's probably easy to install more vents, but a lot of them are just going to overheat tremendously in a lot of our hot weather. And you can cover those with shade cloth as well during a heat wave. This just shows you, look how much like disease this looks like on these tomatoes. This is not disease, this is heat injury in a greenhouse. So stay alert for spring frosts. They're not going away, as I said before. So whether it's glass cloches or recycled jugs or, floating row cover, we still need to be ready for that. But for our Arctic outbreaks, they're going to be colder and longer sometimes. 2 years ago, we had February where we basically had almost 3 weeks of an Arctic outbreak. And the Eastern Canada and the northeast of the US has just been through record-breaking, stunningly cold weather. And that could be us next year. So be ready to cover vegetables and sort of half-hardy herbs and things like that. You can just do it temporarily with plastic covers or tarps. It's too cold for photosynthesis, so it doesn't have to be a clear plastic. It can be a tarp of any kind. And here is one under the snow. It helps to hold the tarp up a bit or support it with almost anything, just to prevent crushing by snow. But even if things get crushed, they'll pop right up again. You can make more permanent covers for winter as well. And a lot of homemade things, people do all kinds of things. The principle here is low profile, sturdy for wind, and very well secured. So this was one that was on Salt Spring for years. It latched down, it had rebar legs into the soil. It was very, very sturdy, well-designed little tunnel. You don't want something that'll blow away in that winter windstorm, and you want something that can withstand the snow. And, good old, centuries old school cold frames work great. If it's really, really cold, you can close up the glass and throw some kind of insulating cover over the top of that glass. And that's much, much warmer than being out in the garden. Probably the single most useful gardening technique for so many reasons is mulch. So mulching year round, it keeps the soil cooler in the summer, but warmer in the winter. And we lose less water in the summer from evaporation. It protects the soil from erosion in the winter and from nutrient loss because you don't have the rain pounding directly on the soil. It's blunted. The action of that rain is blunted. It also, as they break down, builds organic matter. And as you will see in a little bit, that helps to build soil carbon and just increase the fertility of the soil. And the big bonus here is it's your weed control. If you have a mulch most of the year on the garden, whatever weed seeds do germinate, they don't really have a chance, those tiny little seedlings. There's a period of time in the spring when I have seedlings that I'm getting started that I will pull the mulch off the garden and let the soil dry out, get the seeds started. And as soon as I need to, I'll start moving that mulch back and then on into between the seedlings. And then it'll be the rest of the year. There will be mulching on that soil. Be prepared for even heavier rainfalls. And this is where you may have to look at waterlogging. Places in the garden that might have been adequate before, as I said earlier, they may not be so good now, especially trees and shrubs and perennials that you're planting. They're going to feel the effects. You may need to add raised beds for winter vegetables, even though in general you're growing not in raised beds. But keep the soil surface covered with plants and mulch to protect it from erosion. Plan for even drier summers, and for years and years we've been working on installing water conserving irrigation systems, whether it's drip systems or these linear systems for vegetables. Collecting household water. There's a lot of household water without even going into a more elaborate system of collecting gray water. There's a lot of water that isn't even gray water in our households. It's vegetable washing water. It's water while you're waiting for the shower to warm up so that you can step in. That water can just go straight out to the garden. It's not, just collect it and take it. And consider trying to plant your fruit trees and shrubs and your landscape material, perennials, in the fall. They will need less water the next summer. As new plants, they will need regular watering in their first summer, but they will need less of it if they've had the winter to get their roots established. These trugs are great. This just fits my kitchen sink and is easy to pinch it and make a spout out of it. And I think this is a rhododendron getting a shot of water. You can make a little funnel. You can do quick you can quickly dump the water into a funnel and then it will leak out around the plant slowly. Collect rainwater. There's actually no shortage of water over the year, of course, as we look at the year, but it's a shortage of places to store the water. You can get quite a lot. These 2,000 gallons here comes just off of half of this small garage. And there are rainwater harvesting rebates, depending where you are. Look into what's going on in your community, Salt Spring here. And high winds can happen anytime. So, and if you were a gardener, a food gardener, and you have fruit trees, they can really catch the wind, especially in the fall when they're loaded with leaves and fruit. And then we have many vegetables that are quite top heavy. All the cabbage family vegetables, the big ones, broccoli and cabbage, but also tomatoes and Brussels sprouts. Think how tall those are, and corn. They need support during the growing season. And trellised things going up, once you get this bean trellis, once this is full of beans all the way to the top, it's really going to catch the wind. And this is a very nicely designed, very sturdy trellis here. So, over-engineer your trellises a bit. Dwarf trees, dwarf fruit trees on dwarfing rootstock, the dwarfing aspect is that the rootstock is smaller. And so support those trees, probably for most of their life, give them good support. And then in the winter, it's not just wind, but heavy snow can pull plants right out of the ground and break a lot of leaves, and especially our cabbage family plants. This is where my tomato trellises go. Tomato cages go in the fall. They get moved over to the cabbage family plants, or lots and lots of stakes to keep them from getting broken. The woody plants that we may be growing in our landscapes and gardens, our grape trees, our grapevines and roses, they will have quite a load, winter wind and snow on them as well. And I've taken to doing a two-step pruning process where in the fall, I prune a lot back just to get the bulk of the stems and branches off of trellises and fences. I have crammed my yard with plants so that every fence and every trellis has something growing on it. But when we get heavy wet snow or high winds in the winter, that can be damaging. So I finished doing the fine pruning in February when we would ordinarily do our dormant pruning. And I've also found that the native plants, the shrubs that I've put along, I'm making a hedge of different native plants, even though they're fairly good sized, they still require some support from heavy snow. And I've taken to driving those steel fence stakes down into the middle of the shrubbery just to give some support so that we don't get them broken. Okay, so what can we do also in gardening that helps to mitigate climate change? Well, anytime we can increase the carbon held in the soil, it removes it from the atmosphere. That's what plants do. That's why we want to plant a lot of trees. Carbon is held in the plant tissue itself, in their roots, in the humus in the soil, which is the organic matter that has been very finely decomposed. Carbon is also held in the soil microbes in the soil. And there's carbon that is mineralized or attached to the soil minerals very deep in the soil profile. The carbon held in the deepest soil profile lasts up to 1,000 years, but there's less of it than the carbon that's held in the more active part of the roots and the upper part of the soil. And that might last up to 50 years. So, but that's the largest bulk or proportion of carbon in the soil. So maximizing the amount of living roots throughout the soil year round is one way to hold carbon in the soil. And no gardener minds being told to plant more plants. Add more plants, more, and greater variety to yards and gardens, and increase the density of plantings where you can. Add things that climb to fences. You notice I didn't say climb things up your trees because you don't want to increase the wind throw of your tree, but grow ground covers under shrubs. The deep soil carbon is deposited by plant roots, and especially trees. They hold the carbon in their roots, and the channels that they create also remove that dissolved organic carbon meters deep in the soil. and it bonds with mineral particles. Now, this was thought to be a really small part of the carbon in the soil, and fairly recent work has shown that they weren't looking deep enough. There's actually really deep soil carbon that's getting there through the action of plant roots and this carbonic acid being moved. This is a local back garden, was postage stamp size, went right up the side of the house. You can get a lot into a small space. So designing climate-friendly food gardens, basically producing as much as you can in the smallest area and fill that garden up. You know, some gardens are more ecological than others. Some use a lot of space and a lot of equipment, and others, this was a very low cost, the little garden here on the right. You could hardly walk in there, but she had managed to cram in a stunning amount of food into a city lot in Victoria. Building soil organic matter, the carbon held in the humus, which is the really decomposed form of organic matter, can last not too long, but up to 50 years. But the humus also improves the soil structure and water holding capacity of your soil and nutrients. So one of the ways you can get it, and actually one of the best ways to do it, is leaving crop residues and mulches and prunings on the surface. I just call it chop and drop. Will build soil organic matter faster than digging in compost, oddly enough. Anytime that you put organic matter on the surface, as opposed to cultivating it in, you'll build soil organic matter faster. And leave all those plant roots in the soil. This is a corn plant at harvest time, when I would have cut one of the ears off. But, you know, it's a grass, lots and lots of organic matter here. If you leave that in the soil and don't remove that corn stalk until spring, this is what I leave in the soil. This is what's left. All of that organic matter stays in the soil where it should. Minimizing soil disturbance slows the release of soil carbon because it slows down the activity of soil microbes. So using no-till methods or very infrequent shallow cultivation is really the way to go in your annual gardens, in your vegetables, and you may have some annual flowers. You know, once a year, I find that I need to just very lightly comb in the soil amendments, the compost. I am on acid soil, so I have to add lime every now and then. And I just under the top couple inches, 7 centimeters at most, nothing being turned over. And then after you've done that once in a garden, a vegetable garden for the summer, you don't need to do that anymore. Using organic fertilizers and organic and composts as your plant food, basically, it means that you can just keep planting. So anytime you can plant without cultivating, do it. This is a bed that had peas growing in it. Of course, peas are a legume and their roots are fixing nitrogen. Once you cut the plant off and the roots die, the nitrogen becomes available to the next crop. So the bed already is being fed with nitrogen. I cut the peas down, leave them on the soil. So I already have this pre-fed, pre-mulched soil, and all I did was cut the pea vines down. Can just take a trowel, put in the cauliflower for winter. And this is what my corn patch looks like at the end of the summer. It's just the stubs. And I've seeded various leafy greens all around the corn stubs. You don't have to clean that all up. You don't have to disturb the soil, just pop the seeds in. Compost with care. Poor compost that's been allowed to be soggy and smelly and waterlogged. That is compost that is developing under what are called anaerobic, not aerated conditions. There's no oxygen there. That releases methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, even more so than carbon dioxide. And you're losing nutrients. Don't put lime or wood ashes in a compost pile. If your soil needs lime, you can just put that straight on the soil. If you have wood ashes to use, it's a fantastic amendment for soil, but keep them dry and put them on in the spring when you do all the rest of your additions to the soil. If you put alkaline materials in a compost, the conditions that sets up, the more alkaline conditions, it favors a different group of microbes that are digesting that organic matter. And the ones that really thrive in that are ones that release nitrogen to the air. And again, loss of nutrients, but also another greenhouse gas. So compost correctly, or move to mainly a chop and drop surface composting. I used to, years and years ago, I had a market garden, and we're talking many years ago, and I composted material. I've gotten to the point now where I basically don't compost except my kitchen waste. And it's all added back to the soil by being put on the surface in one way or another. And I think there's a really important part of this, which is to think about reducing the area of cultivated gardens, whether it's annual flowers or vegetables, and lawns. Because if you can produce a lot more by improving how you garden in a small space, if you can get what you need out of a small space, then you've got more space to plant native trees and restore native vegetation, wildlife habitat, add flowers for insect forage. Lots and lots of our important insects, whether they're pollinators or predators, rely on flower, pollen, and nectar to sustain their life cycle. So maximizing the harvest from a smaller food garden by growing crops intensively, interplanting. This is my who needs a pathway anyway garden. I know where things are. Harvesting year round makes the most use of a smaller space. So if you can get away with a smaller garden and produce as much as you need, then that leaves land for other ecological purposes, for perennial planting and tree planting that will hold more carbon in the soil. So there's some other things we can do. I mean, we can replace the use of peat moss with compost or wood fiber or core, which is coconut waste. The peat bogs on the planet hold more carbon than all of the standing forests put together. And by using up peat moss, we are accelerating that loss. Try and reduce the use of plastic and eliminate it where you can. It's very hard to find substitutes for some things we're used to using that are made out of plastic. But any plastic we have now can last for many, many years if we take care of it. I'm still using plastic sheets that were part of the materials covering construction materials when my house was built 22 years ago. And I'm still using those to cover vegetables in the wintertime. Carefully put plastic out of the sun for the summer, wash it and put it away. And it will last a very long time, and you won't have to buy any new material. Recycle what you can and try not to buy new products. The avoiding artificial nitrogen fertilizers, the process of making those fertilizers takes an enormous amount of energy. And it also they release nitrous oxide to the atmosphere, another greenhouse gas. So as organic gardeners, compost, manure, organic materials, I didn't really have time to go into the rationale for learning to save seeds, but if you do save seeds, you can be selecting plants that are adapted to what's going on in your garden and maybe to more variable weather. As we keep saving seeds of our vegetables, particularly our crop plants, well, all of our crop plants, not just vegetables, over time, then those plants should be becoming more adapted to the kinds of, the climate, the weather that we're getting now. And it also enhances our local seed and food security. 3 years ago, when COVID started, the seed situation in vegetables became really acute. Suddenly people were buying up seed and there was a lot of seed shortages, and it's still not really sorted out. So that was just one event. And some of the fires in California and some bad weather in other parts of the world have really cut into the availability of certain vegetable seeds because those things were grown in those areas. And of course, if you've got gas-powered tools and can move to electric or manual tools, that's another approach. So this is my last slide. This is kind of the wind up. Resilient gardeners make resilient gardens. And being flexible, I'm still, as I mentioned earlier, rethinking things that I thought I knew about gardening on the coast. Even just last year, a few interesting curves were thrown to us, whether it was the long cold spring or the long hot fall. So we have to be prepared to keep asking questions, rethinking everything, and trying new things. So designing and managing our gardens to protect our plants from extreme heat. I think heat's going to be the big one for most of us, but also cold, drought, high winds. Think about waterlogging, that may not have been a problem. Choosing plants and cultivars that can tolerate variable weather, which we're going to see by growing a lot of different things and seeing how they do. Continuously adapt cropping schedules to whatever's going on, and be prepared to just cut your losses and replant. Listen to weather forecasts and act promptly. If the cold's coming, don't wait. Cover things up. If it's heat waves, get the shading materials out. And we can keep building carbon, increase the carbon in the soil with mulching and year-round planting, and particularly with deep-rooted perennials and trees. And you may need to make some long-term plans, because some of these things are more costly than others. Enhancing plantings, installing rainwater storage, and micro irrigation, and restoring native plant habitat. It's going to take a while to do that, but think about moving in that direction. And, you know, act promptly, use your garden and landscape to help capture the carbon. And of course, for the long term, join community, provincial, national, global efforts to reduce our output of greenhouse gases, but also to adapt to a changing climate. And Transition Salt Spring is a very key project on our island that is doing that. So there we go. I'm glad to see how many people are on. We have quite a lot of people on online today, and put questions in the chat, and we will see what we can do about answering questions.
Thank you, Linda. This was incredible. I learned so much. I'm sure everybody else did as well. And yes, if you have any questions, just pop a question in the chat, and we'll take the next 20 minutes to share those questions with Linda and answer as many as possible. Patty, do you want to get us started?
Certainly. Thank you, Linda. And as Inga's popped in the chat, we're going to be sending you the recording of this event, and we will too include all the resource links that popped up in the chat. And I would like to say, wow, because it's a surefire reason for us to ensure to get Linda's monthly newsletter on what to expect in the garden each relevant month, given that we're looking at such erratic patterns coming ahead. So I'm going to popcorn some questions here. One of the questions that Midge had asked, you say it reduced the use of peat moss, but isn't it good that peat bogs hold a lot of carbon instead of releasing it into the atmosphere?
Yes, it's great. So we shouldn't be buying peat moss, because in the process of extracting it, then it starts to break down in whatever, you know, we put it in our soil or our garden bed or our planting soil or something. So no, it needs to stay where it is and to hold that carbon. Canada is actually, interestingly, a world leader, I understand, in restoring peat bogs. But if you don't damage the peat bog to begin with by extracting the peat, then that carbon stays where it is. It's very acid conditions in the bog, and it just stays there. As soon as we take it out, put it in our gardens, it begins to decompose, and that carbon starts on its pathway to be lost.
Greg is asking, curious what your suggestions are for best manures to use.
Well, the best manure is the one you can get, you know, and that's not easy. Some of you are in agricultural areas, and a lot of you are going to be in urban areas, and urban people are not going to find manures easy to get at all. And there are some very good composts available, commercial compost, municipal compost, your own compost, that you can use instead of manure. But whatever manure you get should be composted before you use it. If it comes from chickens, pigs, or cows, it's a good idea to compost it if it comes from horses, but it doesn't have to be. If it comes from sheep, goats, rabbits, there's even a place over in Vancouver Island that was selling llama manure. Those animals, the manure doesn't have to be composted first because it's lower in nitrogen. So it's really what you can get. And if you can't get it, don't worry about it. There's lots of excellent composts around that you can buy. The fish wood waste composts get rid of 2 environmental waste issues. I'm talking about things like sea soil and earth bank. And if you're coming in from Washington State, Ole Mountain makes one. And what this is wood waste and fish waste that composted together make a really top quality compost where you wouldn't risk bringing in any plant diseases or weed seeds.
Mhm. Thank you. So some questions on apples from Emily, and her question is, I already planted a Granny Smith apple tree, which was on both of the lists to be susceptible to different diseases. What can we do to protect vulnerable plants and increase their calcium uptake?
Well, the problem with the calcium uptake, the problem with the ones that are prone to these stress disorders, is that when it gets really hot and dry, the plants just can't take the calcium up because they have to close the stomata. So one thing you can do is be right on top of your irrigation. So don't let the trees sit there and be dry all summer. If they're on dwarf rootstocks, they probably have to be watered a couple times a month and maybe every week in hot weather. So all you can change there is the watering, because you can add all the calcium to the soil you want, but if it's too hot and too dry for the plant to take it up, the soil can be absolutely rich in calcium and not make any difference. So good mulching will keep the roots cooler. That'll help, and keep the soil moist. So I think be really on top of your watering. As far as diseases go, pruning so that there's really good air circulation moving through the foliage, that will help slow down scab, for example. And any diseases of wet weather, if the leaves dry quickly, there will be less spread of disease than if the leaves are kind of crowded together and it takes a long time for them to dry out, which just gives the pathogen more time to be producing spores.
So on that topic of pruning, like traditionally, for example, for apple trees, we would prune them, for example, in late February. So, but you're suggesting do your main pruning at a specific time and then go back into a tree?
Well, it depends what your tree is like. I actually do a lot of summer pruning on mine because they otherwise they're too vigorous. Dormant pruning is the traditional pruning period, and you can shape a tree, that you can do all the pruning in the dormant period. And that's absolutely fine. And it's good because you can see the branches. And so it's much easier to see what's going on with the tree. But if the tree is, but dormant pruning stimulates growth. So if you've got a tree that's growing too much, it can be going a little bit crazy in the summer. You can also do summer pruning in early August. Now we're talking about apples. I have every peach I've ever grown and my cherry tree, they cannot be pruned in the winter at all because they grow way too much in the summer otherwise. So they're on my list for only summer pruning. But it doesn't matter when you're pruning with respect to how you prune the tree, the shape of the tree. You still want good air circulation through the foliage when it has leaves. You can do that at either time. It's more how you want to control the growth that determines whether you're doing summer or winter pruning.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'd learned from you in the past is that when you're doing the dormant time pruning and there's not very much foliage, or there's no foliage, you can actually see the sacs of the tent caterpillars.
Oh yes, they're very visible now. Yes, they're much easier to see right now.
Thanks, Linda. There are a couple of questions about biochar. What you're thinking about biochar, and if to put it straight into the compost or directly on the garden.
You can do either, actually. I mean, I know that, one way to use it is to put it in the compost first, which, gets microbes into the biochar, and then you can move it to the garden, because that's assuming you have a compost, which again, a lot of us probably don't really have a compost or have just a cool compost pile. You can do it either way. Biochar is a mixed blessing. It's when you've got lots and lots of truly waste woody material that can be heated in that way, and it does make a good soil amendment, and it will hold carbon in the soil. But unless it's truly waste material and it's properly heated at the right temperature, it in fact is not going to be doing what you hope it's going to be doing. So biochar is one of those things that is hyped as being all good, and it has many benefits, but it has some drawbacks. And actually, even in some of them, I was reading something the other day about even the biochar changing the soil to be a darker color allows the soil to heat up more, and we actually don't want that. So and we don't want to dig it in because that adds to the cultivation and increases the loss of carbon. So there's places where it's going to be a very good addition, and circumstances where the materials that are used for biochar are excellent and they're waste. And there's going to be places where it isn't going to be a solution. And if you're not using biochar, don't worry about it at all. You have an excellent garden. It is not something that anybody has to go and buy or use in order to have a very good carbon holding profile and fertility profile. So, you know, in the commercial world, this is not something that's going on Salt Spring, but I've seen advertising in gardening websites. Some biochar products are actually being made of plantations that are being cut down to make biochar, which is completely insane. So if it's a commercial product coming from somewhere else, like, be really aware that some of this isn't making much sense. You know, so a true waste product is one thing. But if it's just because biochar is a thing, you know, then you don't need it. You know, we've got lots and lots of organic matter and true living trees, deep roots into the soil that are going to be holding carbon as well.
Mm-hmm. And also an advantage of having loads of biomass that people think that they must be burning, we can actually be using that biomass to create berms and plant trees.
Yes, absolutely. Just can digest, and it's wonderful organic matter to stay on the surface. It doesn't have to be made to go away, you know, leave it. All good. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely right, Patty.
And so there are some questions about mulching, and there's two questions because one's a carbon and one's a nitrogen element. But Annika is asking, and Maureen were asking about mulching, and Annika was suggesting that the only downside of mulch is harboring slugs below. And Maureen was asking, will cardboard work well as mulch?
Well, slugs, yeah. Well, the thing is about slugs, whether you had mulch or not, you're going to have slugs. But mulching also harbors the ground beetles that eat the slugs. Mm-hmm. So I personally don't think you come out behind on the slug issue at all with mulch. And when it comes to cardboard, the role of cardboard as a mulch is really useful when you want to kill something. You want to kill the vegetation underneath. So cardboard is excellent, but it also is going to, if it's there too long, kill the soil microbes as well, because it prevents moisture and light and air and oxygen, carbon and oxygen exchange in the soil. So if you want to suffocate a piece of lawn so that you can grow a vegetable garden there, putting cardboard down is great. But if you want to have it around your crop plants, then it should be some kind of mulch that allows moisture, water to get through, and air to get in, oxygen to get in, and carbon dioxide to get out. And so I guess you could use shredded cardboard, but you certainly wouldn't want to use solid pieces of cardboard around plants that you want to have grow well.
This is a pretty specific question, but I think it might address something other people are experiencing as well. When the heavy rainfall happens, I get pools of water in low parts of my front yard. It disappears within 12 or so hours of the rain stopping, but should I try to get the draining faster to avoid waterlogging, or is that fast enough for it to dissipate?
Oh, no, that's a great question, because, you know, the way it rains here, and it always has done, when it really rains, it can really come down. If it's clearing within 24 hours, it's probably fine. You know, yes, I mean, a whole yard can be pretty splooshy in the middle of a rainstorm, but clearing within 12 hours, if you're walking on it and you don't get that feeling of sploshy water, it's probably fine. Plants can certainly take that much. It's waterlogging, you know, we've had a few dry days. If it's still wet out there now, then it's definitely going to be a site you might want to try and drain, or build raised beds in, or put planters on, or something like that.
Okay, thank you. And our heroic plant, kale, such a heroic plant. And there are some questions, because one of the things was that Emelita asked, I find kale regrows from cut roots. And this is referring to you suggesting that we cut the top of corn, for example, off and leave the stalk in the garden. Yeah. And she would like to remove it from a bed to crop rotation. And Sky suggested cutting below the soil surface helps with the avoiding of regrowth. But also a question was that if you're leaving the stalk in the ground, once you cut it off, are you not pulling too much nutrients out of the soil?
Well, you do want to kill the plant. So I do find like, when I'm suggesting leave the roots in the soil, I'm also suggesting that if it's going to be a woody stalk that's in the way, for example, those corn plants, I actually remove the little stub of stalk that's left in the spring. But you're right, cabbage stumps and kale stumps. I actually myself, I do exactly what Sky was suggesting. I take a hori-hori, or you can take a kitchen knife and go vertically around the stalk. So you're severing all of those roots, and I take that stump out because it's going to be in the way, and you'll be surprised at how quickly the roots die. But yeah, if you just cut it off high, it'll come back. I mean, in fact, people often grow kale as a perennial plant until we get a really bad winter. You know, we know that some of that cabbage family acts like perennials. So whatever, but if tomato stalks get very tough and big, so you might want to cut those out, just cut under or around them and pull that big stump out, but let the rest of it go. Once the main part of that crown is gone, then it disintegrates very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Another question that came in, Linda, is on Galiano Island, and I know some people here on Salt Spring are doing it as well. Folks are planting drought-tolerant trees in the forest that are non-native, like ponderosa pine, sequoias. What are your thoughts on adding non-local native trees into our forests?
Well, my thoughts have been evolving over time. I'm not a forestry expert at all, and it has plagued our forestry people trying to figure out what they can plant, what will be a forestry as opposed to something like a landscape in a city. What is going to be a good thing to plant in our forests? But recently, if any of you have a chance to read Nature's Best Hope by Doug Ptolemy, I really suggest you do it. It's an excellent read, and I think it'll change your viewpoint on what we plant and grow and why, because the basis of loss of a lot of insects is loss of their food plants, and insects feed everything else. In fact, insects make the biomass that is formed by photosynthesis. Insects drive that through the entire ecosystem, whether it's disintegration of organic matter in the soil, or whether it's feeding birds, or we need masses of caterpillars to feed 97% of all the bird species. That's what they feed their babies on. And if there's no native trees, then there's no native caterpillars. And insects are very specific about what they eat. A lot of them just eat 1 or 2 species of trees. And as soon as we change out our forestry or our landscapes from what they can eat to non-native plants, the number of species of insects that can survive on those trees goes way down. And then we don't have food for everything else that happens in the ecosystem. So I've been getting there slowly, but I really urge you to read Douglas Ptolemy's work. He's a very well-respected ecologist that's been working for many, many years and has a big team of people, and there's a website, but I know the local garden club has a copy, and a lot of people have a copy of that book. I would beg, borrow, I won't say steal, but I'll beg or borrow a copy of Nature's Best Hope, and it might change what you think we should be planting.
Wonderful. Natasha, perhaps you can dig up the link to that website, that reference, and share it in the chat. Linda, question about our trees, because we have the mildewy covered maple leaves, and we have the arbutus or the madrona trees that are looking rather grim at times. Can we use those once those leaves drop on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing about plant pathogens is they're even more specific than insects, if possible. So if it's a disease that goes on the arbutus tree, it won't go on anything else. And you could use those leaves quite safe. Same with the maple trees. I know the maple trees looked very weird this year with the white mildew on them, but that is, although powdery mildew looks similar on many different plants, it's actually all different species of fungi. So the one that's on the maple actually could not get on your roses or your beans or whatever. So don't worry at all about using those leaves in mulch or making compost with them or whatever. And I might add about the arbutus trees, although there are a couple blight or fungal diseases present on arbutus trees, a lot of what we see is also frost damage. and it looks just like the disease, and it's very hard to know which is which. So, but even if it is the disease, the leaves can still be used.
Wonderful, thank you.
Blackberries. I certainly have lots of those taking over parts of my landscape. Somebody is wondering if you take out the blackberries, what to cover the soil with until you're ready to actually plant a vegetable or flower garden.
Yeah, when you say take out the blackberries, I hope you're meaning to get the roots out, because you can't cut them off and hope that's going to work. They just come right back. And so once you've entirely removed the root system, you could mulch with any kind of organic matter that you could get. If it's going to be a while, you could put in a cover crop that will basically hold this space, you know, and provide some nutrients to the soil as the roots develop. But you're going to always need to be alert. You know, there'll be a few years of being very watchful about whether every little chip of blackberry root is sprouting and catching it before it grows very quickly. So it really depends when you want to use that soil, how soon.
Mulch the heck out of it, hey?
Yeah, mulch, any kind of mulch is good. You know, if it's a short-term thing, anything, even cardboard would work, but you can, you know, an opaque tarp or cardboard very long will begin to affect that soil community. So, you know, if it's just for a little while, it's not, it's, you know, it's fine. But if it's not weedy there, you don't, you know, just adding the organic matter on top would be what you would want to do, and start feeding that soil and preventing other weed seeds from jumping in there.
Well, Maureen had a question at the very beginning, and it was, I bought topsoil, but my plants don't like it. Should I just toss it into the compost? Why aren't plants liking the topsoil that she's purchasing in general?
You know, most of the soils, well, it can say good topsoil or it can say good garden soil. I don't know what she's meaning to grow, but I'm assuming vegetables, because vegetables are a whole different class of plant from our landscape material and our native plants. Our native plants, we don't add anything to the soil for our native plants, and even fruit trees and things don't need as much nutrients as vegetables do. So vegetables are little piggy plants, and they need total nutrients, water, they need everything, you know, available quickly, because we bred them to do that. So if you want a big head of cabbage, that's what they have to have. The plant will sit there and live fine, you know, without that, but it just won't produce the crop we expect. So no soil that you buy is good enough for vegetables by itself. So she probably needs a good compost. And, you know, there's some really good quality, complete organic fertilizers now. You know, 40 or 50 years ago, when I first started organic gardening, you had to go and find all those individual ingredients and mix your own fertilizers. And it was crazy. Now you can go to your local Buckerfields or, you know, Foxglove here on Salt Spring has an excellent proprietary mix they get made for our soil that is an organic fertilizer, and it's complete, and it already has everything you need. So compost and a complete organic fertilizer for the first few years, and then see how things are growing. And you may not need to put the fertilizers in after that. You would just be using a regular addition of compost. So yeah, don't get rid of that soil. Soil is expensive and valuable. Feed it and make it live. As you add organic matter and compost, then the soil microbes will develop there. So even if it's seems kind of dead at the moment, it will thrive. So probably it's just needing more nutrients. It's almost always a lack of nitrogen, available nitrogen to vegetables. And that comes through the addition of the compost, complete organic fertilizers.
Okay, thank you.
Another question about invasive plants. Any idea how to kill ivy and preventing it from climbing up our trees?
Well, when it's going up a tree, you need to sever that as soon as you can at the ground level and just stop that. Then that growth will die on the tree. When ivy goes up, it changes its growth pattern, and that's when it starts to produce seeds, little berries and seeds, and birds pick it off and spread it all over the place. So the priority with ivy is to sever those vines that are heading up anything, driving up trees or whatever, and stop that process of spreading ivy all around the neighborhood. So that's the first thing. After that, if it's not spreading elsewhere, you can deceive. It's going to be a manual control job. You're going to have to get in there. If it's an area when you want to grow another plant, you're going to have to get the ivy roots out. There's really no way around that. And ivy's not easy to kill with, say, putting cardboard on top. It's just too woody and too viney and can grow sideways too well. So
Are you suggesting that we should actually eradicate ivy if you have it in your gardens? It's not growing upwards, even if it's not growing upwards?
Well, growing upwards is a priority because that's where you're spreading to the rest of the world. Then you decide if you can live with your ivy. It's a ground cover. It's a plant. It's holding carbon. If it's doing what you want it to do in your garden, just as long as you prevent it from being an invasive to other people's gardens. I mean, some people are really wanting to eradicate ivy, period, but realistically, if we can stop it from spreading, that's like step one. You know, when I used to live over on the Saanich Peninsula, I had neighbors that liked broom and they were going out and digging it up and planting it in their yard. And I was like, oh my God. You know, so we all have our things we want to do in our yards, but try not to do things that affect other people's, plantings.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. Wow. I'm just learning so much, and I'm super excited to take some of my takeaways into my garden, and I hope everybody else also learned and is going to take some action on what you learn. And I will now ask Hilda Logan, our Transition Salt Spring board member, to say a few words about Transition's climate action work.
I'm going to speak to you a little bit about Transition Salt Spring so that you know who we are, what we do, and can help us continue offering really amazing programs like this. Our mission and focus, of course, is to mobilize people on the island to mitigate climate change and to work together in unique and interesting ways to do that. We are guided by our Climate Action Plan, which 2.0, which is on our website. And I think, Natasha, if you don't mind, you could put the link in there for us. There's 250 recommendations in our Climate Action Plan that are specific to our region and cover all these different areas that you see here: forest, fresh water, governance, etc., as well as it talks about climate justice and equity. Transition Salt Spring has many programs that help you. For example, there's the Climate Action Coach Program, which guides you and supports you in doing your part at home. So they can help you find rebates, they can guide you in actions that you can do at home to do your part to reduce your carbon footprint. So there's lots of different things that that we do help people replace wood stoves with heat pumps, collect water, all of those kinds of great things that we can help you out with. So that's one program we do. Another program is the Climate Action Research Lab that's up on Mount Maxwell on Salt Spring Island. And that is a program that brings together many, many different people, scientists, First Nations, educators, lots of people to begin to look at that unique system to try to prevent fires, to restore the watershed, protect our water supply, and that you can learn a lot more about that program on our website, but there's a great deal of community members and even provincial members involved in that research lab. So what can we do? In addition, Transition Salt Spring works with a bunch of different groups on the island. We provide, like services for you, like a space to meet, bookkeeping, insurance, all sorts of things for a bunch of different groups, the invasive plants, one of them. We have an electric vehicle group, and many other things. So there's lots of different supports that we provide to other people on the ground. We're also developing a climate action report card to see what we're doing well on Salt Spring and what we maybe need to keep working on. So that's another one of our projects. We have many more, but those are just a few so that you know that what it is we're doing, and you can find out more on our website. There's two ways that you can help us out. One is please to stay involved and informed. So you can sign up for our website. Sign up for the newsletter, and you can do that right on our website. And that will give you heads up about events such as this one with Linda. You can also donate, and it's really important as an NGO for us to have a stable source of funding. So we appreciate all donations, even small ones. And it's particularly important for us to have monthly donations, because that gives us a stable source of funding. So if that's something that you're able to do to help us out, we would really appreciate it. For those of you who live on Salt Spring Island, of course, we do the Save a Tape program number 7 at the Country Grocer, and that helps us out as well. Thank you again, Linda, and also to all the organizers of this event, Patty, Inga, and Natasha, and thanks to all of you for attending today.